If you're having a good time listening to Bradbury 100, please check out my other podcast, Science Fiction 101. And don't forget to visit my website at bradburymedia.co.uk. This is Bradbury 100, celebrating the life and works of American writer Ray Bradbury. Hello and welcome once again to another one of my Chronological Bradbury episodes, where I'm working through Ray's stories in the order they were originally published. We're now 6 years into Ray being a published writer, and we finished last time with about a third of his 1944 output covered. There are 12 more stories to go in 1944, which is Ray's busiest year yet. In today's show, I'll cover 6 of those stories, and most of these fall into the category of crime fiction or detective stories. But Ray being Ray, you'll never get a straightforward crime or detective story. There will always be some fantastical element or twist to the proceedings. But let's get started with the 8th story Ray had published in 1944. Killer Come Back to Me, or as the story was titled when Ray first submitted it, Autopsy. This story appeared in Detective Tales magazine in July 1944, and for the longest time, this story was really hard to find. After that initial appearance in Detective Tales, it didn't get reprinted until 2014, when the Collected Stories Critical Edition Volume 2 came out. Now, even if Ray didn't care for the story too much and withheld it from republication, you might think that it might have been included in A Memory of Murder, which was that collection of pulp crime stories that came out under Ray's name in 1984. But no, it wasn't in there. That issue of Detective Tales, July 1944, is also very elusive. There aren't any online versions of it that I can find, and I've looked in all the usual places and a few unusual places. Now, this probably means that print copies are also hard to come by. And in fact, for decades, I only knew this story from the radio adaptation, which was on Malay Mystery Theatre, May 1946, the first ever adaptation of a Bradbury story on radio. And of course, the radio version could be very different to the published version of the story. So for years, it was very difficult to get a handle on this piece as a piece of prose fiction. Anyway, thanks to the Collected Stories Critical Edition, we can now have access to it. Plus, it appeared as the title story of the book put out by Hardcase Crimes in 2020, Killer Come Back to Me, The Crime Stories of Ray Bradbury. As I mentioned, Ray's original title for this story was Autopsy, and according to John Eller's notes on the story in the Collected Stories, the alternative title, Killer Come Back to Me, was imposed on the story by the editors of Detective Tales. And apparently there is no evidence that Ray ever approved the change of title. Killer Come Back to Me is a noir tale. There's a femme fatale, there's some identity switching. As published, the story is broken into 3 chapters. Chapter 1 introduces us to Johnny Brogman, whose cadaver is being autopsied by the story's narrator. Brogman is some kind of gangster, recently deceased. And the story proper begins with him about to undertake a robbery, but then a woman appears who sneaks him away, saving him from certain death. And then we find out in Chapter 2 what her intention is. She is the girlfriend of Los Angeles boss Ricky Wolf, recently deceased. And she needs Brogman, who bears a very faint bodily resemblance to Ricky Wolf. She needs him to impersonate Ricky and convince other gangsters in LA that Ricky is still alive and still in charge. Now, some of Ricky's henchmen see right through this deception, but they implicitly go along with it, accepting Brogman as Ricky. Chapter 3 then resolves the tension between Brogman and the woman, who, it turns out, still carries a torch for her late beloved Ricky. Now, I can't say that I really care for this story at all. Ray isn't writing Bradbury here. He's clearly trying to emulate the style of others. Now, don't get me wrong, it's a reasonable pastiche of the film noir style, and no doubt Ray could have made a living from the basic skills that he's demonstrating in this story. But just as he sometimes comes a cropper when he tries to write in the Planet Stories style, the Lee Brackett style, so he runs aground somewhat with this sub-Chandler, sub-Dashiell Hammett style. It's easy to see why Ray never made any efforts to keep this story in print, and indeed why it never turned up in any anthologies during his lifetime, let alone in his own collections. The radio version that appeared 2 years later, the very first appearance of a Bradbury story on radio, is possibly a bit more enjoyable than the story. It has Richard Widmark in the lead role, which from our vantage point adds a bit of credibility to its noirish potential. Although Widmark's fame as a star of film noir didn't come until a year after the broadcast of Killer Come Back to Me. It was in 1947 that he earned an Oscar nomination for his debut movie, Kiss of Death. The Long Night. This story first appeared in New Detective in July 1944, and subsequently was collected in A Memory of Murder, and you can also find it in Collected Stories of Ray Bradbury, a critical edition, Volume 2. In the mid-1940s, Ray had an office in downtown Los Angeles, in a tenement building. It was somewhere he would go during office hours to do his writing, and then he would go home at night. And he did apparently also sleep overnight at the office from time to time. Now, this was during a period that the so-called Pachuco riots took place, also sometimes referred to as the Zoot Suit riots. Now, this was a spate of civil unrest that took place between the 3rd and 8th of June, 1943. What appears to have happened is that some white American servicemen stationed in the area and some white locals attacked some local Mexican-American or Latino men, ostensibly for wearing zoot suits. You know, those large, stylish suits which some people reckoned were a waste of fabric in a time of war when everything had to be carefully rationed. Angelenos who wore zoot suits and adopted the fashion and the music culture associated with them identified themselves as Pachucos, and hence the term Pachuco riots. Now, why am I telling you all this? Well, because Ray lived through this. It happened right in his neighbourhood, and it involved people he knew, Latino friends and neighbours, and the epicentre of events was just down the road around the area of Temple and Figueroa. And somewhat rarely for Ray Bradbury, he incorporated this real life happening into his fiction. The Long Night is set against the background of the Pachuco riots. Most of Ray's published fiction up to this point really ignored world events. He became a prolific and highly published author as the Second World War was happening, and yet, as we've seen, there's barely a mention of the war in his fiction. Pretty much the only instance I can think of was that story about the Ducker, which I discussed a couple of episodes back, and another story that's coming up later in today's episode. But here he is, writing in 1943 and witnessing racism and unrest right on his doorstep, and he uses it for a story. And it's not just the backdrop, actually. The unrest is woven into his narrative. What's the story about? Well, it's told from the point of view of a young Mexican-American who's supposed to be about 18 years old or so. He's a smart dresser. He hangs around with pachucos, but he denies being one himself. Then there's a murder. Someone from the neighbourhood is killed in a fire, which appears to have started in a water heater which he was attempting to repair. Except our focal character, the narrator of the story, goes to inspect the scene of the crime and finds clear evidence that the man in question had had his face forced into the water heater first. There's a mass of burned hair inside the heater. The fire, it seems, was merely a cover-up to hide the fact that a murder had taken place. Then there follows a series of deaths as our hero investigates further, and as rioters, hundreds of them, begin tearing through the neighbourhood. One of the murder victims is the narrator's brother, who was innocently investigating for himself. Another is the very large woman Fanny Floriana, a fortune teller who knows everything about what goes on in the neighbourhood. In particular, there is a strong suspicion that the rioting, the Pachuco riots, has actually been sparked by Nazis or Nazi sympathisers who have deliberately provoked racial tension between whites and Latinos. Eventually, our hero figures it all out and confronts the killer, but is left at the story's end completely unnerved by these unsettling events. Not just the murders, but the riots as well. Since The Long Night is framed as a whodunit, I'm not going to give away the ending. So you can go and read it for yourself and be shocked, surprised, stunned, whatever, by the revelation of who done it. But I will say that, in my opinion, Ray doesn't really succeed with the whodunit aspect, because honestly, he doesn't give us enough clues for us to be able to sensibly guess who the killer is. But it is a great atmospheric story, and certainly one of his best and most engaging crime stories. Apart from the unusual topicality of the story, and for being the first story to reveal Ray's affinity for the Latino culture of his adopted city of Los Angeles, the story is also notable for connections it provides to other later stories. The broad setting will turn up again, most notably in his 1950s story, The Wonderful Ice Cream Suit. And a couple of characters that we meet here return in some stories published later. There's Massinello Pietro, who gets his own short story 20 years after this, published in 1964. And Fanny Floriana makes a glorious 1985 comeback in Ray's crime novel Death is a Lonely Business. Yesterday I Lived. Or, as Ray titled the story, No Phones, Private Coffin. This story first appeared in Flynn's detective fiction in August 1944. And you can find it in A Memory of Murder, and in the Collected Stories of Ray Bradbury, a Critical Edition Volume 3, and in Killer Come Back to Me, the Crime Stories of Ray Bradbury. Yesterday I Lived is another whodunit, but this time Ray lays the clues out rather better, because they emerge from the characters that he's created. Our main character is Cleve, a Hollywood security man who spends his days at the security desk buzzing people in and out of the Hollywood studio. Like everyone in the world, he's in love with Hollywood star Diana Coyle. So it comes as a big surprise when one day Diana just drops dead on set. There's every indication that she was poisoned, and in fact, There's even film footage of her final moments as she chokes and turns to face directly into the camera. The police in this story are fairly inept, and they're unable to solve the mystery. And so 3 years pass before Cleve finally figures it out. And he does this by watching a series of outtakes from Diana's final movies. Most of the outtakes seem to show her co-star, Robert Denham, screwing up her scenes and blaming her, which places the spotlight of suspicion for her death on him. But there's more to it than that. But again, this is a whodunit, so I won't give a spoiler in case you want to go and read this story for yourself. But Ray does the whodunit format right this time, in my opinion, because he gives us a range of possible suspects and he gives us their motives. The story's title, Yesterday I Lived, which was imposed on the story by the magazine editor, is a bit odd. Yesterday I lived. You might think that the story is told in the first person, but it's not. Yesterday I Lived presumably refers to the fact that the story has us seeing Diana alive on screen after she's dead. But since Diana isn't the storyteller, that's a bit nuts. We do know that it's not Ray's title. It was imposed by the magazine editor. The presentation of Hollywood in this story, and in particular the idea of a film studio which is right next to a graveyard, is something Ray will return to late in his career with his novel A Graveyard for Lunatics. It's all based on reality, by the way. Paramount Studios really does adjoin the Hollywood Forever Cemetery. The Hollywood ambience, the successful use of whodunit, and the effective use of language all make for an interesting story here. It's not a Bradbury all-time classic, but it's entertaining and solid all round. The Trunk Lady. This story first appeared in Detective Tales in September 1944. You can find it collected in A Memory of Murder and in the Collected Stories of Ray Bradbury, a Critical Edition Volume 2, and in Killer Come Back to Me, The Crime Stories of Ray Bradbury. With The Trunk Lady, we're back in the attic, just as we were in that other 1944 story, Reunion. This time we're up in the attic with young Johnny, who doesn't get on very well with his parents or with the rest of his extended family who share the house. Isolating himself in the attic, away from the big social gathering his mother is throwing downstairs, Johnny finds a trunk half open and is shocked to find inside it a dead woman. Now he tries to report this to his parents, but in the middle of their party this is just an embarrassment to them. It's not the done thing to talk about corpses, so the parents laugh it off and tell Johnny, you're clearly mistaken, and they send him away. Angered by this, Johnny later drags the trunk from the attic and tips it over at the top of the stairs so that the corpse will fall out, absolutely proving his point that there's a body in the trunk. Except that's no body. It's clearly a mannequin. To the family, this is taken as proof that Johnny was wrong all along. There never was a corpse. It was only ever a tailor's dummy. But Johnny vigorously denies this. This mannequin is nothing like the body he saw earlier. Somebody has swapped them to cover up a murder. Johnny reports his finding to the local policeman, but his reaction is simply to drag Johnny round to his parents and tell them to keep an eye on their disruptive child. Anyway, Johnny is now faced with a whodunit. He's certain that there was a body, but he can't be totally sure whose body it was. Maybe it's Ellie, who was expected to turn up and become his home tutor. Well, in any case, Who could possibly have a motive? Johnny's vivid imagination provides him with plausible motives for each one of the family. Father has a motive, mother, grandma, Uncle Flinny, cousin William. Once again, I'm going to withhold the ending from you in case you want to go and read the story and enjoy the murder mystery aspect of it. As I've indicated, this story has some echoes of Reunion, which I discussed in a previous episode. It also has some resemblance to a later story Ray will publish, The Screaming Woman, which is published in 1951. And this story, The Trunk Lady, is an early example of what I like to call Ray's bad parenting stories. In Bradbury stories, we find lots of parents who refuse to engage with their offspring's gameplay, and usually the parents come a cropper because of it. Think of the parents in The Veldt, who just want to leave their kids under the control of the virtual reality nursery while they busy themselves with whatever it is that parents do all day. Or the parents in 0 Hour, who end up being invaded by aliens because they always tell their daughter to run along and play, there's a good girl. According to John Eller's textual notes on The Trunk Lady in Collected Stories, a critical edition, Ray's friend Henry Kuttner, the successful short story writer across many different genres, Henry Kuttner told Ray that he thought The Trunk Lady was his best crime story. And it possibly is, although I think it's a little overlong and a little repetitive. It just needs a tiny bit of judicious trimming. Ray, however, may not have been so confident in this story because he never included it in any of his main collections. Bang, you're dead. This story first appeared in Weird Tales in September 1944. And you can find it today in Bradbury Stories, 100 of his most celebrated tales, and in the Collected Stories of Ray Bradbury, a critical edition, Volume 2. And this story is the return of Johnny Quire, the Ducker, from a story that Ray had published in 1943 called The Ducker. Well, if you remember that story, this one is more of the same. Johnny Quire is miraculously able to duck enemy fire in World War II. Only this time he's in Italy as US forces try to push on towards Rome. Johnny's odd ability to avoid enemy fire, purely instinctive rather than anything he's ever been taught, comes from his childhood. In children's games of war, a child is only ever dead, in air quotes, if they believe they're dead. While Johnny sees the real war as a game, so he genuinely, in his heart of hearts, doesn't believe bullets hit him. And so they don't. Now, all of that was laid out in The Ducker, and it's continued here in Bang You're Dead. This time Johnny has a best pal called Private Smith. And there's also another soldier hanging around called Melter, who's a big, heavy guy who is somewhat jealous of Johnny's ability. He's deathly scared of dying in this war, and he asks Johnny, how do you do it? Johnny can't really say, but he thinks maybe he can teach Melter how to duck, how to avoid the bullets. Except, of course, it turns out he can't. It's not something that can be taught. It's more of a magical power than anything else. Well, Melter thinks Johnny is winding him up, making fun of him. To test Johnny, to see if Johnny really does have the ability to duck bullets, he fires a series of potshots straight at him. And every time, Johnny ducks and cries out, "Missed!" Unfortunately, Melter manages to persuade Johnny that it is all a lie, that Johnny is as mortal as everyone. And so in the next battle, Johnny gets hit by artillery fire and is unable to duck. Well, good news. There's some kind of MASH unit nearby, and both Smith and Johnny are nursed back to health. Nobody dies. Well, other people in this war die, but not our main two characters. Smith then has to reteach Johnny the importance of his innocent worldview. It's Johnny's innocence that protects him. Only if Johnny can believe he's invulnerable to bullets will he be invulnerable. Oh, and as for Melter, whose discouraging talk led Johnny to lose confidence in his own ducking, well, Melter overconfidently runs head-on into enemy machine gun fire and dies in a hail of bullets. Oh, sorry, that was a spoiler. There's not really much between this story and The Ducker, its predecessor, except that this one truly confronts Johnny's belief and questions it, and reveals the truly weird way in which it operates. And there is some very fine emotion on display in this story, especially the anger of Melter and the sympathy of Smith. If anything, although this is a sequel, Johnny seems more innocent in this story than he did in the previous one. In The Ducker, it seemed as if he knew how his abilities worked, but here he seems a bit more naive. But I think that serves the conflict better. And then, The Silence. This story first appeared in Super Science Stories in October 1944, and the only place you'll find this is in Collected Stories of Ray Bradbury, a critical edition, Volume 1. With And Then The Silence, we're back to science fiction. After a run of crime stories, we're back to solid ground, the kind of thing that Ray cut his teeth on. John Eller's researches indicate that this story was actually completed in December 1942, so it took nearly 2 years to see print in October 44. And Then The Silence is quite a short piece, just a couple of pages, and its narrative form reminds me very much of the earlier, shorter science fiction pieces that we thought Ray had moved on from. It's told entirely from the point of view of, as we learn, an alien race. We learn this at the end of the second paragraph of the story, so Ray draws us in and then does a little switcheroo and makes us realise, oh, this is being told to us by an alien. This is how the story begins.
We let them come in. They set their long, silver ships down in the valleys, on the plateaus and plains. We let them come in without moving against them. All of us watched and waited and communicated to ourselves about the invaders. It was almost a joke. We knew they were coming? Yes, we knew. We heard them coming across space. We counted 1,000 of their projectiles shooting through the void. They were running away from something. They had to run. Their planet, which they called Earth, was no longer habitable. They built ships and escaped from Earth before it was too late.
Now it turns out that these aliens, who call themselves the Zoton, are quite happy to let these strange visitors from Earth settle down, become comfortable and complacent, so that they can then attack them. And what did these aliens exactly do?
People were walking and talking and living the warm life. There was laughter and there was songs. And then the mountains moved. And then the sky constricted like a blue fist. And then the rivers tore wild in a torrent from their ridges. The earth crumbled, trembling. The sun glowed hot and violent. Man and his cities were in the nucleus of all this. We killed them. We crushed them and destroyed them. Every one of them. Everyone. Not one escaped. It was a triumph of nature.
So we've made it through about 2/3 of 1944, and Ray still isn't done yet. There's another half dozen tales left to cover, and I'll get to those in a future episode of Bradbury 100. See you then. Bradbury 100 is presented and produced by Phil Nichols, and theme music is by Purple Planet at purpleplanet.com. You can find the show notes and much more on Bradbury at bradburymedia.co.uk. And please check out my other podcast, Science Fiction 101, where we discuss the past, present and future of science fiction. You'll find it wherever good pods are given away.